What if the ground itself could hide an entire missile army, and one bomb just proved that hiding place was never as safe as everyone thought? Watch this footage closely, because what happened over Iran in the last few hours is not a small story, and it is about to change how this entire war gets fought. Before we go further, if you want to actually understand what you are looking at instead of just reacting to it, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about this stuff. Subscribe if you have not already. Turn on notifications. And if you know someone who has been following this war but keeps getting confused by the headlines, send them this video, because we are about to make it make sense. Let's start with the scene itself. Reports coming out of the region describe a strike near Isfahan in central Iran, hitting what is described as an underground facility carved into a mountainside, reportedly used to store ballistic missiles. What makes this footage different from a typical explosion clip is the way the blast behaves. It does not flash once and fade. It keeps erupting in waves, venting out of the mountain in a rolling sequence that continues well after the first impact. That pattern is not random. According to defense analysts, when a bomb designed to penetrate underground gets deep enough before detonating, the explosive force has nowhere to escape except through the weak points of the structure itself. The shafts, the tunnels, the access points. If the facility really was storing missile stockpiles, as multiple reports suggest, then what people are seeing on screen looks like secondary explosions. Fuel and munitions igniting one after another because the initial strike found its target. Now, here's the part that actually matters if you want to understand why this specific weapon keeps showing up in this war. Multiple reports identify it as the GBU-72, sometimes referred to as an advanced bunker-penetrating bomb weighing around 5,000 pounds. It reportedly entered service with the U.S. Air Force a few years ago and is designed to be carried by aircraft like the F-15E Strike Eagle. Think of the different bunker-busting weapons in the American arsenal like tools in a toolbox, each built for a different job. At the very top sits the massive ordnance penetrator, a weapon so large it reportedly can only be carried by the B-2 stealth bomber, reserved for the deepest, most hardened targets. On the lighter end, there are smaller bunker-busting bombs that work fine against shallow targets, but reportedly struggle against anything buried extremely deep. The GBU-72 sits in between those two extremes. It is heavy enough to punch through serious rock and concrete, but light enough that it does not require sending a stealth bomber across the world just to use it. It might sound like a small detail, the difference between one bomb and another, but in modern warfare, these gaps in capability often decide the entire shape of a campaign. Commanders do not choose weapons based on what looks impressive. They choose based on what gets the job done with the least risk and the least cost. And a weapon that fills a gap other options cannot reach tends to become the default choice almost immediately once it proves itself in the field. That gap between the heaviest weapon and the lighter ones is reportedly exactly what Iran spent decades trying to exploit. By building storage and production facilities specifically deep enough to survive anything short of the largest bombs, while betting that adversaries would not want to spend a rare stealth bomber mission on every single target, Iran may have assumed a certain level of protection. The introduction of a mid-sized penetrator changes that calculation entirely, because now there's a weapon that can reach many of those depths without needing the rarest aircraft in the fleet. What makes this bomb interesting from an engineering standpoint goes beyond its size. A bunker buster is not meant to explode the moment it touches something. If it did, it would barely scratch the surface and waste its own power. Instead, these weapons are reportedly built with a hardened casing that lets them survive slamming through earth and concrete. This casing is paired with a delayed fuse that counts through the layers of material before triggering at the depth it was aimed for. According to available reporting, this class of weapon can push through around 100 feet of earth and more than 20 feet of solid concrete before detonating. Picture what that actually means. Iran reportedly spent years building something like an underground city inside a mountain, engineering it specifically to survive a conventional bombing campaign. A weapon like this does not simply blow a hole in the surface. It is designed to ignore the layers of protection entirely and detonate exactly where the mountain was supposed to keep everything safe. There's also a guidance detail here that says a lot about how flexible modern strikes have become. This type of bomb can reportedly be used purely with satellite guidance, meaning coordinates get programmed in before the aircraft ever leaves the ground. It can also be guided by laser, with the crew making live corrections as it falls. And if that laser tracking gets interrupted, whether by smoke, weather, or evasive maneuvers, the weapon is designed to fall back on the last confirmed satellite coordinates instead of losing its target completely. That kind of built-in redundancy usually comes from lessons learned in actual combat, not just theory on paper, and it matters enormously when the aircraft delivering it is flying through contested airspace. It also helps to understand where this weapon fits historically. Bunker busting technology traces back decades, but the modern version of this idea really took shape during the Gulf War, when a laser-guided penetrator was rushed into service specifically because commanders needed something that could reach hardened underground bunkers. That same basic idea has resurfaced again and again since then, reportedly used against underground facilities linked to other conflicts in the region. And now, according to current reporting, against Iran's own underground missile network. Every generation of this weapon exists because every generation of whoever is digging keeps going deeper. And every time that happens, engineers respond by building something that goes deeper still. It's also worth remembering that this back and forth between digging deeper and building weapons that reach further is not new, and it is not unique to this particular conflict. Underground military infrastructure has been part of warfare for as long as air power has existed, because the moment one side gains the ability to strike from above, the other side responds by moving what it values most below the surface. Every time defenses adapt, offense eventually catches up, and then defenses adapt again. What makes this moment notable is not that the pattern exists, it is how quickly the gap appears to be closing this time, with a weapon purpose-built to sit in the exact middle ground that adversaries were counting on staying protected. This also does not appear to be the first time this specific weapon has been used in this campaign. Earlier reports describe similar strikes along Iran's coastline, aimed at hardened sites believed to house coastal missile systems positioned to threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. So what we are watching now looks less like an isolated headline and more like a continuation of a pattern that has been building for months, with the focus reportedly shifting from coastal missile sites toward deeper inland production and storage facilities. There's another angle worth sitting with here, and it's the psychological weight of this kind of weapon, separate from its physical effects. For decades, going underground was treated as close to a guaranteed form of protection. Militaries around the world have built entire strategies around the assumption that if something is buried deep enough, surrounded by enough rock and reinforced concrete, it becomes effectively untouchable. That assumption shaped how Iran designed its missile program, how it positioned its production facilities, and how confident its leadership could afford to be about the survivability of its most important assets. A weapon that reliably defeats that assumption does more than destroy a single facility. It undermines the entire theory of protection that an adversary has been relying on for years. That is a much bigger deal than any single explosion, because it forces a rethink of every other buried facility across the country, not just the one that got hit. Why does the F-15E keep showing up as the aircraft of choice for missions like this? Part of the answer is capability, since it is a twin-engine fighter built to carry a heavy payload. But the bigger part of the answer is speed. If intelligence confirms a high-value underground target, commanders do not necessarily need to route a heavier bomber from a distant base. With fighters already positioned in the region, the strike package can reportedly be in the air and over the target inside a much smaller window. Delivering the weapon and returning home before the situation on the ground has time to shift. That speed of response is central to how this entire campaign appears to be structured, striking precisely where intelligence points and withdrawing before anyone can reposition. If you are finding this breakdown useful, this is a good moment to smash that like button because it tells the algorithm this kind of detailed analysis is worth showing to more people. And if you want to be here for the next update the moment it drops, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you do not miss it. Now let's talk about how Iran has responded, because the reaction has been loud and it deserves context rather than just repetition. Statements from Iranian officials have described the strikes as reckless, warning that the decisions being made now will reshape the situation going forward, and promising a different posture from Iran moving ahead. That is the public rhetoric. Underneath it sits a harder reality. The facilities being targeted again and again are reportedly tied to the ballistic missile stockpile Iran has spent roughly 4 decades building as its primary source of deterrence and leverage. Every strike against that network is not simply property damage. It is a direct hit against the one asset Iran has been counting on to leave this conflict with real strength intact. So when defiant language comes out of Tehran, it is worth remembering that it is coming from a position where actual military assets are reportedly being reduced, facility by facility. It is not only rhetoric either. Iran's naval forces have reportedly declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to shipping, warning that vessels attempting passage could be targeted. Not long after that declaration, reports describe an attempted drone attack on a tanker moving through the strait under cover of darkness. According to statements from U.S. defense officials, both drones were intercepted before reaching the vessel and the ship continued on safely. One of hundreds of vessels reportedly still moving through the strait under naval protection every day. That detail matters because it highlights a real gap between announcement and enforcement. Declaring a blockade is meant to spook shipping companies, drive up insurance costs, and rattle energy markets before a single vessel is ever actually stopped. That is the intended effect. But when hundreds of ships continue moving safely day after day with naval escorts standing by, the practical power of that announcement starts to erode. Insurance markets and shipping companies tend to respond to what is actually happening on the water far more than to what gets said in a press statement. And right now, what is reportedly happening on the water is continued safe passage. That does not mean the risk disappears completely. And it does not guarantee a future attempt will fail the same way, but it does suggest the credibility of that blockade claim weakens a little more every day. It does not materialize into an actual closure. Think about what an announcement like a blockade is actually meant to accomplish before a single ship gets stopped. It is meant to create fear ahead of any real action, to spike insurance costs, to push energy markets into reacting on the assumption that shipping is about to become dangerous. That is the entire purpose of making the declaration loudly and publicly. But markets and shipping companies are generally slower to panic than headlines suggest, because they are watching outcomes, not statements. If vessel after vessel continues moving safely with naval protection standing by, the fear that the announcement was designed to create starts losing its grip. And companies begin treating the threat as background noise rather than an active danger. That shift from real fear to background noise is exactly the kind of erosion that happens when a threat is repeated, often, but rarely followed through on. This also says something about how carefully both sides seem to be managing escalation. Iran appears to be signaling aggression mainly through drone attacks and public statements, rather than a larger direct confrontation with American naval forces. Likely because the imbalance in a direct clash would heavily favor the other side. Meanwhile, the American response so far has been described as defensive and proportional, intercepting direct threats to shipping without expanding into a broader offensive campaign against Iranian naval assets. Both sides appear to be trying to make a point without triggering an escalation that neither side actually wants right now. That balance is delicate, and reports suggest it could shift quickly if a future attack actually connects instead of being intercepted. On the diplomatic side, things look considerably messier. Public statements attributed to the American side have suggested that a deal to end the conflict looked close, with terms reportedly agreed upon at senior levels and expected to be finalized soon. Within hours, conflicting statements from Iranian officials pushed back, saying nothing had actually been finalized. This kind of contradiction is not necessarily strange. It may be a symptom of something deeper cracks inside Iran's own leadership structure. Some factions reportedly appear willing to accept terms simply to bring the bombing campaign to an end, while others are either unwilling to acknowledge that publicly or may not have been fully informed that talks had reached that stage. When one part of a government appears to be negotiating an exit while another part publicly denies it exists, that does not look like unified leadership speaking with one voice. It looks more like a government under enough pressure that its internal divisions are becoming visible from the outside. There have also reportedly been sharp public statements criticizing Iran for leaking distorted versions of negotiation terms to the press. Statements that do not match what was reportedly agreed to in writing, along with criticism describing recent drone attacks on shipping as unacceptable. Whatever the exact wording, the underlying message is consistent. Trust between the two sides is thin, and both sides appear to know it. Situations like this tend to reveal themselves slowly, through small inconsistencies, rather than one obvious announcement. A single contradictory statement might mean very little on its own. But when contradictions start piling up, when one official says one thing, and another official says the opposite within the same day, that pattern starts to tell its own story, regardless of what either side intends to reveal publicly. Governments under real strain rarely announce that strain directly. It shows up instead in these small cracks, in mismatched timelines, in statements that do not quite line up with each other. Watching for that pattern often tells you more about the true state of a negotiation than any single headline does. It is worth pausing here to talk about why Iran built its defenses this way in the first place, because it explains almost everything happening right now. According to available reporting and satellite imagery from earlier construction phases, facilities like the one near Isfahan were built over years, with separate storage structures, dedicated access roads, and tunnel entrances carved directly into the terrain. These entrances are reportedly built to look unremarkable from a distance, blending into rugged, forgettable hillsides, unless someone knows precisely where to look. That is intentional. The broader strategy reportedly involves multiple entry and exit points, allowing missiles to be moved deep into a mountain for storage, then rolled back out to a launch position, fired, and withdrawn before a retaliatory strike can locate them. Multiple points of access mean multiple paths to survival. It is a patient, long-term defensive doctrine, similar in concept to underground military infrastructure used by other actors, built on the assumption that no adversary would spend an unlimited number of expensive precision weapons chasing every possible entrance. That same logic also creates an incentive for deception. Iran reportedly has every reason right now to build decoy structures designed to resemble legitimate storage sites, hoping to draw a strike toward an empty target instead of a real one, which is exactly why intelligence and surveillance work matters just as much as the weapon itself. A precision bomb is only as effective as the information guiding it, and right now, this underground strategy appears to be getting tested in close to real time. Here's the harder problem underneath all of this that does not get discussed enough. Iran's missile reserves near Isfahan are reportedly not sitting exposed somewhere convenient. They sit inside what is believed to be one of the country's largest missile production and storage complexes, engineered across decades specifically to withstand a sustained conventional bombing campaign. Reports suggest this general area has already absorbed a significant number of bunker-buster strikes across this conflict. And yet, there continue to be accounts of missiles being launched from the same region the following day. Why does that keep happening? Because the actual depth these facilities reportedly reach into the mountain goes well beyond what earlier strikes were capable of touching. Ending the threat requires reaching that true depth, not simply damaging the entrance, and that appears to be the specific gap this newer weapon is now being used to close. If you zoom out and look at how this entire campaign has unfolded, a clear sequence emerges. Earlier phases reportedly focused on radar systems and communication infrastructure, limiting Iran's ability to coordinate a response. The next phase reportedly moved toward command and control systems, cutting the connection between decision makers and forces in the field. And now, strikes appear to be moving specifically toward ballistic missile production and storage, the actual capability behind Iran's ability to retaliate. That does not read like a random sequence. It reads like a campaign built with a deliberate order, systematically narrowing Iran's options in a way designed to eventually force a decision. Whether that decision comes from exhaustion, internal fractures, or simply running out of stockpile to threaten anyone with. Which brings us to the real question, sitting underneath everything discussed so far. What does Iran actually want out of this, and what is the other side actually trying to achieve? From Iran's side, reports suggest the priorities include resources to rebuild damaged infrastructure and a strong preference to keep the final size of any remaining missile stockpile secret. Iran reportedly understands that the hardest line being drawn concerns its nuclear program, so whether it ultimately gives up all of that program remains uncertain. But underneath that nuclear discussion sits a quieter, arguably just as important fight over the missile stockpile. Because that stockpile is reportedly viewed internally as the insurance policy behind everything else, including nuclear ambitions, drone capability, and any leverage over shipping through the strait. Remove that stockpile piece by piece, facility by facility, and everything else Iran is trying to protect becomes significantly more exposed. That is what appears to actually be at stake in these bunker-buster strikes. And it is why this particular target set keeps getting hit again. One quick thing before we keep going, if this kind of grounded, detail-first breakdown is what you come to this channel for, drop a comment telling me what part stood out most to you. It genuinely shapes what we cover next, and while you're there, tap subscribe so you are in the loop the moment the next development breaks. Before wrapping up, it's worth zooming out to the bigger picture beyond just this one theater, because there's a broader shift happening in how modern militaries are preparing for the future. Legislative moves have reportedly advanced to establish a dedicated command structure focused specifically on robotics and autonomous systems, placed at a senior tier alongside other major regional commands. That is a meaningful signal about where military investment and doctrine are heading. Drones, autonomous systems, and increasingly capable unmanned platforms are likely to make up a growing share of how future conflicts unfold, and this campaign already shows early hints of that shift, including reports describing an autonomous system assisting in a rescue operation involving a downed helicopter crew. Keep an eye on that space because a dedicated command structure typically means resources, doctrine, and career paths all begin scaling around that technology, shaping how conflicts get fought over the next decade. So where does this actually leave things right now? There is a physical campaign accelerating, with bunker-buster strikes reportedly dismantling parts of Iran's underground missile infrastructure piece by piece, while at the same time the diplomatic track is showing signs of real movement and real fracture simultaneously. That is not necessarily a contradiction. It may simply be what pressure looks like from inside a government absorbing sustained damage to its most protected assets, with some factions wanting a way out. In the middle of all of that, commercial shipping reportedly continues moving through the Strait of Hormuz, protected by naval forces actively working to keep it that way. Conflicts like this one rarely end with a single dramatic moment, a clean signing or a clear surrender that closes the book all at once. They tend to end messily. Strikes and negotiations happening on parallel tracks that do not always agree with each other, and with factions inside a government pulling in different directions. Watching a bunker buster strike one day, and hearing talk of an imminent signed agreement the next, followed almost immediately by denial from another faction. This might look like chaos, but it could just as easily be a sign that the pressure applied so far is real enough to be splitting leadership into camps. What happens in the coming days may tell us a great deal about which side of that internal argument ultimately wins out. Underground has always meant safety, until the moment it doesn't, and that is the story unfolding in these mountains right now. Decades of tunnels, decades of concrete, decades of betting that depth alone would be enough, and one weapon is now testing that bet in real time. Whatever direction this goes next, the ground itself is no longer the safe place it was assumed to be, and maybe that is the real lesson sitting inside all of this. Every strategy built on the belief that something cannot be reached eventually meets the moment someone builds the tool that reaches it anyway. That has been true throughout the entire history of warfare, and it appears to be playing out again right now in a handful of mountains most people had never heard of. I want to hear what you think this leads to. Do you believe these bunker-buster strikes continue, or do you think the diplomatic track wins out? Type your answer in the comments. I read through every one of them, and I am genuinely curious where this audience thinks things are headed. If you want more breakdowns like this one, the kind that actually walks through the weapons and strategy, make sure you are subscribed, because this story is far from over, and we will be here tracking it strike by strike and update by update. Thanks for spending this time with me. Take care. I will see you in the next one.